They say love conquers all. But what happens when the people you love most in this world prove that theory wrong in the cruelest way imaginable? What happens when your own flesh and blood leaves you stranded like a piece of forgotten luggage at the happiest place on earth? My name is Rachel Young, and at 80 years old, I thought I'd seen every shade of human nature. I was wrong. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. This isn't just another family drama. This is about discovering who people really are when they think you have nothing left to offer them. It's about learning that sometimes the most devastating betrayals come wrapped in birthday ribbons and Mickey Mouse ears. And it's about understanding that wealth doesn't just change how people see you. It reveals who they truly were all along. The Florida sun felt different on my skin that March morning as I sat on the edge of my hotel bed, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of coral and gold. 80 years old today, 8 decades of breathing, loving, losing, and somehow still standing. I never imagined I'd be celebrating this milestone at Disney World, but life has a way of surprising you when you least expect it. My son David had called me 3 weeks earlier, his voice bubbling with excitement in a way I hadn't heard since he was 12 years old and discovered he'd made the Little League team. "Mom, pack your bags. We're taking you somewhere special for your birthday." The mystery had delighted me then. Now, as I carefully applied my lipstick in the mirror, the same shade of rose I'd worn for 30 years, I wondered if this old heart could handle all the magic Disney had to offer. I've always been a practical woman. Had to be, really. When you lose your husband at 45 and have to raise a teenage son on your own, practicality becomes your closest companion. My wardrobe reflected this philosophy. Sensible shoes, comfortable pants, cardigans that had seen better decades but still served their purpose. My purse, a simple black leather bag I'd carried for 15 years, held everything I needed and nothing I didn't. Waste not, want not, as my own mother used to say. The phone rang, jolting me from my morning reverie. David's voice crackled through the speaker, bright and energetic despite the early hour. "Happy birthday, Mom. Are you ready for the most magical day of your life?" I couldn't help but smile. At 52, David still had the ability to make me feel like the most important person in the world when he set his mind to it. "I'm ready as I'll ever be, sweetheart. Though I still can't believe you convinced me to wear these Mickey Mouse ears you bought me." His laughter was warm and genuine. "Trust me, Mom. Today is going to be perfect. Sarah and Emma are so excited to spend your special day with you. We'll meet you in the lobby in 20 minutes, okay?" Sarah, my daughter-in-law of 15 years. Our relationship had always been complicated, not hostile exactly, but never quite comfortable either. She was everything I wasn't, polished, ambitious, always perfectly put together. Sometimes, I caught her looking at me with a mixture of pity and impatience, as if she couldn't quite understand how David had emerged from such humble beginnings. But she made my son happy, and she'd given me Emma, my precious granddaughter. So I'd learned to navigate our differences with grace. Emma, now 14, was the light of my life. She had David's kind eyes and Sarah's determination, but something uniquely her own that made every moment with her feel like a gift. She was the reason I'd agreed to this Disney adventure in the first place. When David had mentioned how excited she was to experience Disney World with her grandmother, how could I possibly say no? I gathered my things: sunscreen, comfortable walking shoes, the small bottle of water I always carried, and a few butterscotch candies that had become my signature offering to cashiers and strangers who showed me kindness. My fingers traced the worn leather of my purse, and for just a moment, I thought about the secrets hidden in a safety deposit box 3 states away, secrets that would change everything if my family knew. But today wasn't about secrets. Today was about celebrating life and making memories with the people I loved most. The elevator ride down to the lobby felt longer than usual, my anticipation building with each floor. When the doors opened, I saw them immediately. David waving enthusiastically, Sarah checking something on her phone, and Emma bouncing on her toes with excitement that made my heart swell. "Grandma Rachel!" Emma rushed toward me, her arms wrapping around my waist in a hug that nearly knocked me off balance. At 80, my equilibrium wasn't quite what it used to be, but Emma's enthusiasm was worth the momentary wobble. "Happy birthday, beautiful," David said, kissing my cheek with genuine affection. He looked good. Success suited him. His consulting firm was thriving, and it showed in everything from his confident posture to his expensive watch. I was proud of what he'd built, even if I sometimes wondered if he'd forgotten where he came from. Sarah approached more cautiously, offering a perfectly polite smile and a brief hug that felt more obligatory than heartfelt. "Happy birthday, Rachel. You look nice." Her eyes swept over my simple outfit with barely concealed assessment. I'd learned years ago not to take Sarah's manner personally. She meant well in her own way. "Thank you, dear. You look lovely as always." And she did. Even for a day at Disney World, Sarah looked like she'd stepped out of a magazine. Designer jeans that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, a crisp white blouse that would somehow remain spotless despite a day in the Florida heat, and shoes that managed to be both stylish and practical. I admired her ability to always look put together, even if I didn't understand the effort it required. The shuttle ride to Magic Kingdom was filled with Emma's chatter about all the rides she wanted to experience and the characters she hoped to meet. David and Sarah discussed logistics, fast passes, dining reservations, the most efficient route through the park. I listened to their planning with amusement, remembering how different family vacations had been when David was Emma's age. Back then, our idea of a big trip was visiting the state fair, and our planning consisted of making sure we had enough quarters for the rides. But watching my family's excitement, I felt grateful for how far we'd all come. David had built a life I could never have imagined when he was growing up in our small 2-bedroom house, eating more mac and cheese than any child should have to endure. Sarah's attention to detail meant Emma would have experiences I could never have provided. Different. Didn't mean wrong, I reminded myself. It just meant different. The moment we stepped into Magic Kingdom, I understood why they called it the most magical place on Earth. Despite being 80 years old and thinking I was too practical for such whimsy, I felt something shift inside me. The music, the colors, the sheer joy radiating from every direction. It was impossible not to be affected. Emma grabbed my hand and pulled me toward Cinderella Castle, her excitement infectious. "Grandma, can you believe we're really here? This is the best birthday ever, and it's not even my birthday." Her joy was so pure, so genuine, that I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. When had I forgotten what it felt like to be amazed? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. When had I become so focused on being practical that I'd forgotten to appreciate magic? Our first stop was the Pirates of the Caribbean ride, Emma's choice. As we sat in the boat, drifting through scenes of swashbuckling adventure, I watched my granddaughter's face more than the animatronics around us. Her eyes were wide with wonder, her hand still clutching mine as if to make sure I was really there sharing this moment with her. David sat behind us with Sarah, and I could hear him pointing out details to her, his voice carrying the same excitement it had held when he was Emma's age. "This is incredible, Mom," he said as we disembarked. "I can't believe we've never done this before." Neither could I, really. There had been so many years when a Disney vacation would have been financially impossible, and then later, when David was busy building his career and starting his own family, it had never seemed like the right time. But now, surrounded by my family in this place designed to make dreams come true, I wondered why we'd waited so long. We spent the morning moving from attraction to attraction, Emma serving as our enthusiastic tour guide despite having never been to Disney World before. She'd done her research, armed with information from YouTube videos and travel blogs, determined to make sure we experienced everything important. Her dedication to making my birthday special touched me more than she could possibly know. Sarah, I noticed, was taking pictures constantly. Not the casual snapshots I might have expected, but carefully composed shots that would undoubtedly look perfect on social media. She positioned us for family photos in front of iconic landmarks, adjusting our poses and smiles until she achieved whatever vision she had in mind. Part of me felt a bit like a prop in her production, but I reminded myself that her intentions were good. She wanted to document this special day, to create lasting memories. The fact that she also wanted to share those memories with her online followers didn't diminish their value. By lunchtime, my feet were beginning to remind me of my age, but I didn't want to say anything. Emma was having such a wonderful time, and David and Sarah had put so much effort into planning this day. A little discomfort was a small price to pay for seeing my family so happy. We found a restaurant in Fantasyland, a place that looked like it belonged in a fairy tale. The prices on the menu made me wince internally. $28 for a sandwich seemed excessive, but I reminded myself that this was a special occasion. Besides, David had insisted that everything was his treat, that I wasn't to worry about money today. "Order whatever you want, Mom," he said, gesturing at the menu with the confidence of someone for whom money was no longer a constant concern. "This is your day." I settled on a reasonably priced salad, ignoring Emma's protests that I should try something more adventurous. Sarah ordered something complicated that required multiple substitutions, and David chose the most expensive item on the menu without even glancing at the price. Emma, ever practical despite her young age, chose chicken tenders, the universal safe choice of teenagers everywhere. As we ate, Sarah began taking more photos, this time focusing on the aesthetic appeal of our meal rather than our faces. She arranged her food artfully on the plate, adjusted the lighting, and snapped several shots before taking her first bite. I watched this ritual with fascination. In my day, we said grace and ate our food while it was hot. But Sarah's generation lived in a different world, one where experiences weren't quite real until they'd been shared and validated by others. "Grandma, tell us about your 80th birthday wish," Emma said between bites of chicken tender. "Did you blow out imaginary candles this morning and make a wish?" I smiled at her question, touched by her thoughtfulness. What did I wish for? At 80. What could I possibly want that I didn't already have? "I wished for more days exactly like this one," I said honestly. Days spent with the people I love most, making memories that will last long after I'm gone. The words hung in the air for a moment, carrying more weight than I'd intended. David reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You're going to be around for a long, long time, Mom. Don't talk like that. But at 80, you can't help. But be aware of mortality. Not in a morbid way, but in a practical one. I'd lived through the deaths of friends, siblings, my beloved husband. I'd learned that time is the most precious gift we have, and it's not unlimited. That's why days like this mattered so much. That's why I was willing to endure sore feet and overpriced sandwiches to see Emma's face light up with joy." After lunch, we made our way to the Haunted Mansion, Emma's second must-do attraction. The line was longer this time, giving us more opportunity to talk. Sarah pulled out her phone to show me the photos she'd taken so far, swiping through images that looked like they belonged in a travel magazine. "These are beautiful, dear," I said, meaning it. She had a good eye for composition, and despite my mild discomfort with being photographed so frequently, I had to admit the pictures captured the joy of the day beautifully. "I'm thinking of putting together a photo book," Sarah said, warming to her subject. "You know, as a keepsake of your special day." Maybe something we can all look back on in years to come. The idea touched me. For all her focus on appearances, Sarah was thinking about legacy, about preserving these moments for the future. Perhaps I'd misjudged her motivations. As we moved through the attraction, I found myself studying my family's faces in the dim, spooky lighting. David was pointing out details to Emma, his arm around her shoulders protectively, even though she was clearly more amused than frightened by the ghostly inhabitants. Sarah was still taking photos, but more discreetly now, capturing candid moments rather than posed shots. And Emma was simply absorbing everything, her mind undoubtedly filing away every detail to remember later. These were the people who mattered, most to me in the world. David, the son who had exceeded every dream I'd ever had for him. Sarah, the woman who had given him a partnership I'd never been able to provide after his father died. Emma, the granddaughter who carried forward the best parts of all of us while creating something entirely new and wonderful. The afternoon brought more attractions, more photos, more moments of magic that felt almost too perfect to be real. We rode Space Mountain, where I surprised myself by actually enjoying the sensation of flying through space in the dark. We explored Tom Sawyer Island, where Emma climbed on playground equipment with the unself-conscious joy of someone who hadn't quite decided she was too old for such things. We watched a parade where costumed characters danced and sang with energy that made my own spirit feel lighter. But as the day wore on, I began to notice small changes in the dynamic. Sarah checked her phone more frequently, her responses to Emma's enthusiasm becoming a bit more perfunctory. David started glancing at his watch, calculating something in his head that had nothing to do with ride wait times. Even Emma seemed to be losing some of her earlier energy, though she was clearly trying to maintain her excitement for my benefit. I was familiar with this pattern. It was the way special occasions sometimes unfolded, beginning with genuine joy and anticipation, gradually shifting into obligation and endurance. The magic was still there, but it was competing with tired feet, short tempers, and the reality that even the most wonderful days eventually come to an end. Maybe we should think about heading back soon, I suggested as we finished watching the carousel in Fantasyland. It's been such a perfect day, and I don't want anyone to get too tired. No way, Grandma, Emma protested immediately. We haven't seen the fireworks yet. You can't have a Disney birthday without seeing the fireworks. David glanced at Sarah, some wordless communication passing between them. The fireworks aren't until 9:30, Sarah said carefully. That's still a few hours away. And we have dinner reservations at 7, David added. At that place I told you about, Mom, the one with the character dining. I could see the calculation in their eyes. More time, more walking, more money, more energy required when their reserves were already running low. But Emma's face was so hopeful, so determined to make my birthday celebration complete, that I couldn't bear the thought of disappointing her. Well then, I said, summoning energy I wasn't sure I possessed. I guess we'd better pace ourselves. Maybe we could find somewhere to sit for a while. Let these old bones rest up for the evening festivities. Emma cheered, throwing her arms around me in another enthusiastic hug. David smiled, but I caught him exchanging another look with Sarah, one that carried a hint of resignation mixed with something I couldn't quite identify. Annoyance? Impatience? I pushed the thought away. It had been a long day for all of us. A little fatigue was natural. We found a bench in the shade, and I gratefully settled onto it, my feet practically sighing with relief. Emma sat beside me, chattering about all the things we'd seen and done, her excitement still bubbling over despite the long day. David and Sarah stood nearby, both of them on their phones now, checking messages and making plans I wasn't privy to. This really has been the most wonderful birthday, I told Emma honestly. Thank you for making it so special. It's not over yet, Grandma. The best part is still coming. The fireworks at Disney World are supposed to be incredible, and dinner is going to be amazing too. Characters come right to your table, Her enthusiasm was infectious, but I couldn't help noticing that David and Sarah's conversation was growing more intense. They weren't arguing exactly, but there was an urgency to their whispered exchange that made me uncomfortable. Sarah kept glancing at her watch, and David was rubbing his forehead in the way he'd done since childhood when he was stressed. Finally, David approached our bench, his expression carefully neutral. "Mom, there's been a small change of plans. Sarah just got a call from work, some crisis that needs her attention. She might need to handle some calls during dinner." I looked at Sarah, who was still on her phone, her professional voice crisp and authoritative as she discussed what sounded like a complex business matter. "Of course, dear," I said. "Work comes first, I understand." But Emma's face fell. "Does that mean we have to leave early?" No, David said quickly. "We'll still do dinner and fireworks. It just might be a bit more complicated." The word hung in the air ominously. In my experience, when family occasions became complicated, they rarely ended well. But Emma was already bouncing back, her resilience something to be admired. "It's okay," she said, taking my hand. "As long as we're all together, it doesn't matter if Mom has to work a little. Right, Grandma?" I squeezed her hand, my heart swelling with love for this remarkable young woman who was so determined to make everything perfect. "Absolutely right, sweetheart. As long as we're together." But even as I said the words, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting, that the perfect day we'd been having was about to become something else entirely. Sarah's work crisis seemed to have introduced a tension that hadn't been there before, and David's attempts to manage the situation were only highlighting how fragile our harmony really was. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange that rivaled any Disney magic. Around us, families were settling in for the evening festivities, children's voices raised in excitement as they anticipated the night's entertainment. But our little family bubble felt different now, charged with an energy that had nothing to do with Disney magic and everything to do with the complexities of real life intruding on our fairy tale day. I watched David and Sarah continue their hushed conversation, saw the way Emma was trying so hard to maintain her cheerful demeanor despite sensing the shift in mood, and felt a familiar weight settle in my chest. It was the weight of being a burden, of being the reason for complications, of being the elderly family member whose needs had to be balanced against everyone else's priorities. But I pushed those thoughts away. This was my 80th birthday, a milestone I'd never been sure I'd reach. My family had given me a gift more precious than anything money could buy, a day of magic and memory-making that I would treasure for whatever time I had left. If it ended a bit differently than we'd all hoped, well, that was life. Life was messy and complicated and full of surprises, both wonderful and challenging. What I didn't know, as I sat on that bench watching the sun set over Magic Kingdom, was just how complicated things were about to become. I didn't know that the tension I was sensing was about to explode into something that would change everything between us forever. I didn't know that my family's patience was wearing thinner than I'd realized, or that their view of me was about to shift in ways that would break my heart. I didn't know that this magical day was about to become the beginning of the most difficult chapter of my life. But I would learn soon enough that sometimes the people we love most are capable of hurting us in ways we never thought possible. And I would discover that at 80 years old, I was stronger than any of us had imagined. The character dining restaurant felt like stepping into a storybook, with its whimsical decor and the promise of beloved Disney characters visiting our table. Emma's eyes sparkled as we were seated at a corner table with a perfect view of the restaurant's elaborate interior. The hostess, a young woman whose enthusiasm seemed genuine despite what must have been a long day of greeting families, assured us that Goofy and Pluto would be making their rounds shortly. Sarah immediately began rearranging the table setting, moving salt shakers and adjusting the angle of her water glass to create what I assumed would be the perfect backdrop for more photographs. Her phone was face down beside her plate, but I could see the screen lighting up periodically with incoming messages. Whatever work crisis had emerged wasn't going away quietly. David seemed distracted too, checking his own phone with increasing frequency. The easy joy that had characterized our morning was evaporating, replaced by an undercurrent of tension that made me increasingly uncomfortable. Only Emma remained fully present, studying the menu with the serious concentration of someone determined to make the perfect choice. "The pasta looks good, Grandma," she said, pointing to a description that made even simple spaghetti sound magical. "Or maybe we should share something. So we can try more things?" Her thoughtfulness touched me, as it always did. At 14, Emma possessed an emotional intelligence that sometimes startled me. She was already picking up on the shift, in her parents' mood, and trying to compensate by being extra attentive to me. "That sounds wonderful, sweetheart. You choose whatever looks best to you." The waiter, a young man whose Mickey Mouse ears looked slightly wilted from the Florida humidity, approached our table with practiced cheerfulness. "Good evening, folks. Welcome to Chef Mickey's. Are we celebrating anything special tonight?" "It's my grandmother's 80th birthday," Emma announced proudly before anyone else could respond. "We're having the most amazing day ever." "The cow!" Waiter's enthusiasm ramped up appropriately. 80 years young, how fantastic. We'll have to make sure the characters know we have a very special birthday girl with us tonight." Sarah looked up from her phone long enough to smile politely, while David managed to engage enough to order drinks for the table. But I could see both of them growing more agitated as their phones continued to demand attention. Whatever was happening in their professional lives was clearly escalating. "I'm sorry," Sarah said finally, her voice tight with frustration. "I really need to take this call. It'll just be a few minutes." She was gone before any of us could respond, her phone already pressed to her ear as she hurried toward the restaurant's entrance. Through the large windows, I could see her pacing on the sidewalk outside, her free hand gesturing animatedly as she spoke. David watched her go, his jaw clenched in a way that reminded me of his father when he was trying to control his temper. "Sorry, Mom. Bad timing with this work thing." "These things happen, sweetheart. Don't worry about it." But Emma was looking between her father and the window where her mother was clearly having an intense conversation, her previous excitement dimming. "Is Mom okay? She looks really upset." "She's fine, Em. Just work stuff. You know how it is." Except Emma didn't know how it was, not really. At 14, her biggest concerns were homework and social drama, and whether she'd make the volleyball team next year. The adult world of professional crises and financial pressures was still largely foreign to her, which made her parents' behavior all the more confusing. Goofy appeared at our table with perfect timing, his exaggerated movements and silly antics immediately lifting Emma's spirits. She laughed and played along with his pantomimed jokes, even getting up to dance with him when he extended his white-gloved hand in invitation. Watching her joy, seeing how easily she could still access that pure childlike delight, made my heart ache with love and nostalgia. David managed to smile and take pictures as Emma danced with Goofy, but I could see him glancing repeatedly toward the window where Sarah was still deep in conversation. His attention was fractured, pulled between his daughter's happiness and whatever crisis was unfolding in his wife's professional life. "She's wonderful," I said quietly, nodding toward Emma as she spun around with Goofy's encouragement. "She is," David agreed, but his voice carried a distraction that hadn't been there earlier. "She's been looking forward to this for weeks. Couldn't stop talking about showing you everything, making sure you had the perfect birthday." The weight in his voice suggested that Emma's enthusiasm had perhaps become more pressure than joy for him. I began to wonder if this trip had been more about meeting his daughter's expectations than celebrating my milestone birthday. Not that it mattered. The motivation behind a gift didn't diminish its value, but the realization added another layer to my growing unease. Sarah returned to the table just as our food arrived, sliding into her seat with an apologetic smile. that didn't quite reach her eyes. Sorry about that. Crisis averted, hopefully. But her phone was still lighting up with messages, and I noticed her checking it between bites even as she tried to engage with Emma's continued chatter about the characters and the decorations and how amazing everything was. The divided attention was becoming more obvious, and Emma was starting to notice. Mom, did you see how Goofy danced? He was so funny. That's nice, sweetie. Sarah's response was automatic, her eyes still on her phone screen. Emma's face fell slightly, and I felt a familiar protective instinct kick in. This child had put so much energy into making this day special, had been so focused on everyone else's enjoyment, and now she was starting to feel overlooked. Tell me more. About the dance, Emma, I said, drawing her attention back to me. What was your favorite part? She launched into an animated description of Goofy's comedic routine, her enthusiasm returning as she had an engaged audience. But I could see her occasionally glancing at her parents, hoping to draw them back into the conversation. David was trying, but his own phone was buzzing now, and the effort of staying present was clearly becoming more difficult for him. The meal continued in this fractured way, moments of genuine connection interrupted by technological demands that seemed to grow more urgent as the evening progressed. By the time Pluto arrived at our table, both David and Sarah were barely managing to maintain the pretense of being fully present. Emma posed for pictures with Pluto, her smile bright but less spontaneous than it had been with Goofy. She was beginning to understand that her parents' attention was elsewhere, and while she was too polite to complain, I could see the disappointment settling in around her shoulders like a heavy blanket. We should probably think about finding a good spot for the fireworks soon, David said as we finished dessert, glancing at his watch with the kind of calculation that suggested he was measuring time not in terms of magical moments, but in terms of obligations to be endured. Sarah nodded absently, typing something on her phone with quick, sharp movements that spoke of growing frustration. How long do the fireworks usually last? The question felt wrong somehow. Not because it wasn't practical, it was entirely reasonable to want to know how long we'd be staying, but because it revealed that she was already thinking past this moment, already calculating when she could return to whatever professional crisis was demanding her attention. About 20 minutes, Emma answered, her voice smaller than it had been earlier. But we want to get a good spot, right? So we can see everything? Of course, sweetheart, I said quickly. We'll find the perfect spot. But as we gathered our things and prepared to leave the restaurant, I could feel the group dynamic continuing to deteriorate. What had started as a family celebration was becoming an exercise in obligation, with David and Sarah going through the motions while their real attention remained elsewhere. The walk to find a viewing spot for the fireworks felt different from our earlier explorations of the park. Where we had moved as a cohesive unit before, now we were more like 4 separate people who happened to be walking in the same direction. Sarah and David flanked Emma and me, but they might as well have been miles away, their focus consumed by their respective phones and whatever professional fires they were fighting. Emma tried to maintain her earlier enthusiasm, pointing out decorations and asking questions about the fireworks show, but her voice carried a forced quality that broke my heart. She was working so hard to keep the magic alive, to preserve what was supposed to be a perfect celebration, but she was fighting a losing battle against adult priorities that had nothing to do with birthday wishes or Disney magic. We found a spot near Cinderella Castle with a clear view of the sky, joining hundreds of other families who were settling in for the nightly spectacular. All around us, children were chattering with excitement, parents were arranging blankets and snacks, and couples were stealing romantic moments under the stars. The anticipation in the air was palpable, infectious. Except in our little corner of this magical gathering, the energy felt heavy and strained. Sarah had moved slightly away from our group, her phone pressed to her ear again as she dealt with what sounded like an increasingly complex professional emergency. I could hear fragments of her conversation, something about deadlines and client, expectations, and damage control. And while I sympathized with her situation, I couldn't help feeling that we were losing the battle for her attention entirely. David was trying harder to stay present, but his own phone was demanding attention too. He'd switched it to silent, but I could see him checking it compulsively, his jaw tightening with each new message. Whatever was happening in their respective professional lives was clearly serious, and while I wanted to be understanding, I also felt a growing sadness for Emma, who was witnessing her special celebration dissolve into adult stress and distraction. "Are you excited about the fireworks, Grandma?" Emma asked, settling beside me on the small blanket David had spread on the ground. "Very excited, sweetheart. Though I have to say, the best part of today has been spending time with you." She smiled, but it was a more subdued expression than the radiant joy she'd displayed earlier. "Today has been really special. I just wish—" She trailed off, glancing toward her parents. "What do you wish, Emma?" "I wish Mom and Dad could just forget about work for one night. It's your 80th birthday. It should be special." The maturity in her voice, the way she was already learning to navigate the disappointment of adult priorities superseding family moments, made me want to cry. At 14, she shouldn't have to be the one fighting to preserve the magic of a family celebration. "Sometimes grown-ups have responsibilities that can't wait," I said gently, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. "Your parents love you very much, and they want this day to be special too. Sometimes life just gets complicated." "I know," she said, but her voice carried a weariness that belonged to someone much older. "I just thought today would be different." The first burst of fireworks lit up the sky just then, saving me from having to respond to her heartbreaking honesty. The display was everything Emma had promised it would be: spectacular, magical, a perfect crescendo to what should have been a perfect day. Colors exploded overhead in patterns that defied description, accompanied by soaring music that made even my practical heart soar. Emma gasped with delight at the first few bursts, her earlier disappointment temporarily forgotten in the face of such beauty. I watched her face more than the fireworks, treasuring the way the colored lights reflected in her eyes, the way her mouth opened in wonder at particularly spectacular displays. But even this moment of magic was tainted by the reality of our family dynamic. Sarah had ended her phone call but remained standing apart from us, her posture rigid with stress. David was sitting with us but kept glancing at his silent phone, clearly fighting the urge to check his messages. Both of them were present in body but absent in spirit, and their distraction was becoming impossible to ignore. Halfway through the show, Sarah's phone lit up with what must have been an urgent call, because she answered it immediately despite the noise and chaos around us. She moved even further away, practically shouting into the phone to be heard over the fireworks and the crowd's reactions. David noticed me watching her and leaned over to explain. "Big client presentation tomorrow. Some last-minute changes that could make or break the deal." I nodded, understanding, but inside I felt a familiar ache. How many family moments had been sacrificed over the years to client presentations and professional emergencies? How many times had Emma learned that work came first, that family celebrations were nice but not essential? Don't misunderstand me. I wasn't naive about the demands of modern professional life. I understood that David and Sarah's success required dedication and sometimes sacrifice. I was proud of what they'd built, grateful that Emma would never face the financial struggles David and I had endured when he was young. But watching my granddaughter's face as her mother disappeared into another work crisis during what was supposed to be our special moment together, I wondered if we'd lost something important in the pursuit of financial security. The fireworks concluded with a finale that left the crowd cheering and applauding, a perfect end to what should have been a perfect day. Emma clapped enthusiastically, her joy genuine despite the evening's complications. She turned to me with shining eyes, ready to share her excitement, and for a moment the magic felt real again. "Wasn't that incredible, Grandma? Did you see the one that looked like Mickey's head? And the way they synchronized the music with the colors?" It was absolutely beautiful, sweetheart. Thank you for making sure we stayed to see it. David was smiling too, the fireworks having provided a brief respite from whatever professional stress he was carrying. That was pretty amazing. I'm glad we stayed. But Sarah was still on her phone, still dealing with her crisis, and her absence from our celebration was becoming harder to ignore. Other families around us were gathering their belongings, sharing excited chatter about what they'd just witnessed, making plans for the rest of their evening. We stood in awkward silence, waiting for Sarah to finish her call so we could figure out what came next. I think we should probably head back to the hotel, David said finally, his voice carrying a weariness that hadn't been there that morning. It's been a long day and we all have an early flight tomorrow. Early flight. The words hit me like a physical blow. I'd assumed we'd have more time together, maybe a leisurely breakfast before saying goodbye. But apparently, our Disney adventure was ending more abruptly than I'd expected. What time is checkout? I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. David looked uncomfortable. Actually, Sarah and I need to fly back first thing in the morning. Work stuff, you know. But your flight isn't until the afternoon, so you can sleep in, maybe enjoy the pool. The casual way he mentioned this arrangement, as if it had always been the plan, made me realize that while I'd been thinking of this as a family celebration that would continue until we all went home together, they'd been planning their escape from the beginning. The realization stung more than I wanted to admit. Of course, I said, managing a smile for Emma's benefit. That sounds perfect. But Emma was looking between her parents with growing confusion. Wait, we're not all flying home together? Change of plans, Em, David said, his tone suggesting this wasn't up for discussion. Mom and Dad have some work things to handle. But you and Grandma can have a nice morning together before her flight. Sarah finally ended her call and rejoined our group, her face tight with stress. Sorry, that took longer than expected. Are we ready to head back? She seemed surprised when no one immediately moved, as if she'd forgotten that her phone call had interrupted our post-fireworks celebration. The disconnect between her priorities and ours had become so pronounced that she genuinely seemed unaware of the impact her distraction was having on the rest of us. The walk back to the hotel shuttle was quiet, each of us lost in our own thoughts. Emma had initially tried to maintain her enthusiastic commentary about the day's events, but her parents' distracted responses had gradually silenced her. Now she walked beside me, occasionally pointing out details she'd noticed earlier, but mostly just looking tired and disappointed. I found myself studying my family as we made our way through the crowds of departing visitors. David, my son, who had worked so hard to build a successful life, but seemed to have forgotten how to simply be present in a moment. Sarah, whose professional accomplishments I admired, but whose inability to disconnect from work was robbing her of precious time with her daughter. And Emma, caught between childhood wonder and adult disappointment, learning lessons about priorities that I wished she didn't have to learn quite so young. The shuttle ride back to our hotel was punctuated by more phone calls and text messages, more whispered conversations about professional crises that couldn't wait until after my birthday celebration was over. I stared out the window at the Disney property sliding past us in the darkness, wondering when my family had become so consumed by their professional lives that they'd forgotten how to be a family. Back at the hotel, we gathered in the lobby to say our goodnights, the awkwardness of the situation becoming more apparent as we faced the reality of our early goodbyes. David hugged me with genuine affection, and I could see in his eyes that he knew the day hadn't gone as planned. That work had intruded on what should have been a purely celebratory occasion. Thanks for being so understanding, Mom. I know today got a little crazy toward the end. It was a wonderful day, sweetheart. Thank you for making it happen. Sarah's hug was briefer, more perfunctory, her mind clearly still focused on whatever crisis awaited her attention. Happy birthday, Rachel. I hope you enjoyed Disney World. The formal politeness of her words, the way she spoke as if the day was already a completed memory rather than an ongoing experience, highlighted the emotional distance that had grown between us over the course of the evening. But I smiled and thanked her graciously, unwilling to let my disappointment overshadow Emma's remaining joy. Emma's hug was the longest and most genuine, her arms wrapping around me with the fierce affection that made every challenge of the day worthwhile. I love you, Grandma. Today was really special, even if it got a little weird toward the end. Her honesty about the day's complications, her ability to acknowledge the problems while still finding value in our time together, reminded me why she was such a treasure. At 14, she was already showing more emotional wisdom than many adults possessed. I love you too, sweetheart. Thank you for making my 80th birthday so memorable. Will you call me when you get home? I want to hear about your morning at the hotel. Of course I will. As I watched them disappear into the elevator, David and Sarah already back on their phones, Emma looking back to wave one more time, I felt a complex mixture of emotions: gratitude for the time we'd had together, sadness that it was ending so abruptly, and a growing unease about the family dynamics I'd observed throughout the day. In my hotel room, I sat on the edge of the bed and tried to process everything that had happened. The day had started with such promise, such genuine joy and anticipation. Emma's excitement had been infectious, David's affection had felt real, and even Sarah had seemed committed to making the celebration special. But as the day progressed, I'd watched their patience wear thin, their attention drift toward professional obligations, their ability to be present in the moment gradually erode. I understood the pressures they faced. I really did. Building a successful career, maintaining professional relationships, meeting client expectations, these weren't trivial concerns. David and Sarah had worked hard to create the life they now enjoyed, and I was proud of their accomplishments. But watching Emma's face as her parents disappeared into their respective work crises, seeing her try so hard to maintain the magic of our celebration despite their growing distraction, had broken my heart in ways I hadn't expected. At 80 years old, I'd learned that family time was precious precisely because it was limited. Every gathering, every celebration, every ordinary moment spent together was a gift that wouldn't last forever. I'd hoped that my milestone birthday might remind my family of this truth, might give us all permission to be fully present with each other for just one day. Instead, I'd watched work and stress and professional obligations slowly drain the joy from what should have been a magical experience. I'd seen my granddaughter learn in real time that even special occasions weren't special enough to warrant her parents' undivided attention. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here we were, staying at one of the most expensive resort hotels in the world, celebrating in the most elaborate way possible, surrounded by luxury and indulgence that would have been unimaginable when David was young. Yet somehow, despite all this abundance, we'd been unable to give each other the one thing that really mattered: our complete, undivided presence. I thought about calling David, about trying to have a conversation about what I'd observed, but I knew it wouldn't accomplish anything. He was stressed, Sarah was dealing with her crisis, and Emma was probably already asleep. Tomorrow they'd be gone, rushing back to their busy lives, and I'd be left to process this experience on my own. As I prepared for bed, I found myself thinking about the phone call I'd need to make in the morning, not to my family, but to my financial advisor. There were some decisions I'd been putting off, some plans I'd been reluctant to finalize. But today had clarified some things for me, had helped me understand what really mattered and what didn't. My family loved me, I was sure of that. But they'd also revealed something about their priorities, their capacity for presence, their ability to value relationships over professional success. These weren't necessarily flaws. They were human limitations that we all possessed to some degree. But they were also realities I needed to factor into my planning for the future. At 80 years old, I didn't have unlimited time left to hope that people would change, that circumstances would improve, that the next family gathering would be different. I needed to make decisions based on what was, not what I wished could be. The last thing I saw before turning off the light was the Mickey Mouse ears Emma had insisted I wear for our photos, sitting on the dresser like a symbol of the joy we'd tried so hard to create and maintain. Tomorrow, I'd pack them carefully in my suitcase, a memento of a day that had been both wonderful and heartbreaking, magical and disappointing, loving and lonely all at the same time. What I didn't know, as I drifted off to sleep in that expensive hotel room, was that tomorrow would bring revelations that would make today's disappointments seem trivial by comparison. I didn't know that my family's inability to be present during my birthday celebration was just a preview of how little I actually mattered to them when it truly counted. But I would learn soon enough that love, like magic, can disappear faster than you ever thought possible. I woke to the sound of my phone buzzing insistently on the nightstand, the morning Florida sunshine streaming through the hotel curtains with an intensity that made me squint. For a moment, I was disoriented, forgetting where I was, why I was, alone in this luxurious room that still smelled faintly of the expensive cleaning products Disney used to maintain their impeccable standards. Then it all came rushing back. My 80th birthday, the magical day that had slowly unraveled into something more complicated. The early goodbyes that had felt more like escapes than departures. I reached for my phone, expecting to see a message from David or perhaps Emma, checking to make sure I'd slept well and reminding me about breakfast plans we'd never actually made. Instead, the screen showed a text from an unknown number, clearly a wrong number message about picking up dry cleaning. No birthday wishes, no family check-ins, no plans for our supposed morning together before my afternoon flight. I lay in bed for several minutes, listening to the sounds of other families in the hallway outside my room. Children's voices filled, with excitement about another day at the parks. Parents discussing logistics and making plans. The kind of enthusiastic family chatter that had characterized our own first day here, before everything became complicated. Eventually, I forced myself to get up and face whatever this day would bring. My reflection in the bathroom mirror showed every one of my 80 years, the previous day's emotions having left their mark in the lines around my eyes and the set of my mouth. But I'd faced worse mornings than this one, and I'd survived them, all with my dignity intact. After showering and dressing in comfortable clothes suitable for my afternoon flight, I decided to call David's room to confirm our breakfast plans. I assumed they were probably sleeping late after their stressful evening, but surely they'd want to spend at least a little time together before rushing off to handle their respective crises. The phone rang several times before going to voicemail. David's voice, professional and distant, informed me that he wasn't available but would return calls as soon as possible. I left a brief message, nothing demanding or urgent, just a gentle inquiry about our morning plans and a reminder that my flight wasn't until 4 in the afternoon. 20 minutes passed with no return call. I tried Sarah's number next, though. We rarely spoke directly unless it was about Emma or family logistics. Her phone went straight to voicemail without ringing at all, which meant it was either turned off or she was already on a call. A growing unease settled in my stomach, the kind of uncomfortable awareness that something wasn't quite right. It was possible they were simply sleeping late, or perhaps they'd already left for their early flight and forgotten to mention the exact timing. But the silence felt different somehow, more intentional than accidental. I decided to try Emma's phone, knowing that even if her parents were unavailable, she would want to say goodbye properly. We'd always had a special connection, and I couldn't imagine her leaving without at least a text message or quick call. Emma's phone also went straight to voicemail. The unease in my stomach transformed into something sharper, more urgent. 3 phones, all unreachable. 3 people who had been present and accounted for just 12 hours earlier, now seemingly vanished from the face of the earth. I tried to rationalize the situation. Early morning flights often required 4 or 5 a.m. departures, especially if they were trying to get back for important meetings. It was entirely possible that they'd left while I was still sleeping, planning to call me once they reached the airport or landed back home. The fact that I couldn't reach any of them didn't necessarily mean anything sinister was happening, but the rational explanations couldn't quite silence the growing alarm bells in my head. Something about this felt wrong, felt deliberate in a way that made my chest tighten with anxiety. I decided to go downstairs to the lobby, perhaps catch them at checkout if they were running late, or at least get some information from the front desk about their departure plans. The elevator ride down felt interminable, each floor passing with agonizing slowness as I tried to prepare myself for whatever I might discover. The lobby was bustling with the usual morning activity. Families heading out to the parks, business, travelers checking out with efficient haste, the cheerful chaos of a luxury resort in full swing. I scanned the crowd for familiar faces, hoping to spot David's tall frame or Emma's distinctive backpack somewhere in the mix. Nothing. No sign of any of them. I approached the front desk, where a young woman with perfectly applied makeup and a professionally warm smile greeted me with the kind of enthusiasm that probably required significant effort to maintain throughout an entire shift. "Good morning! How can I help you today? I'm wondering if you could tell me whether the Young family has checked out yet. David Young, room 847. They're my family, and we were supposed to have breakfast together before they left." The woman's fingers flew over her keyboard with practiced efficiency, her smile never wavering even as her eyes focused on whatever information was appearing on her screen. But something in her expression shifted, a subtle change that sent water through my veins. "I'm sorry, but I'm showing that the Young party checked out yesterday evening around 11 p.m. All 3 members of the party." The words hit me like a physical blow. Yesterday evening. While I was in my room, processing the day's events and planning for our morning together, they had been downstairs methodically erasing any trace of their presence from the hotel registry. "I'm sorry, are you sure? David Young, with his wife, Sarah, and daughter Emma, they were supposed to check out this morning." The clerk double-checked her screen, her professional composure beginning to crack slightly as she registered the distress that must have been evident in my voice. "Yes, ma'am, I'm certain. The charges show they departed last evening. Is everything all right?" Everything was not all right. Everything was catastrophically, incomprehensibly wrong. But I couldn't process that reality standing in this busy lobby, surrounded by happy families beginning their magical vacations while my own family had apparently vanished into thin air. "Could you tell me if there are any messages for me? Rachel Young, room 1247. More keyboard clicking, more professional efficiency that felt increasingly surreal against the backdrop of my growing panic. "I'm not showing any messages, Mrs. Young. Would you like me to check with our concierge desk to see if perhaps they left something there?" I nodded numbly, following her gesture toward a nearby desk where another impeccably groomed Disney employee was helping a family plan their touring strategy. The concierge, a middle-aged man whose genuine warmth was a stark contrast to the front desk clerk's professional politeness, greeted me with immediate concern when he saw my expression. "Ma'am, is everything all right? You look a bit upset." I explained the situation as calmly as I could manage, watching his face transform from polite interest to genuine alarm as he realized what I was telling him. He immediately began making phone calls, checking with various departments to see if there had been any miscommunication, any message that had gotten lost in the system. Nothing. No messages, no explanations, no trace of the family that had brought me here to celebrate my 80th birthday and then disappeared without a word. "Mrs. Young?" the concierge said gently, his voice carrying the kind of careful compassion that people use when delivering bad news. "I've checked with all our departments, and I'm not finding any communication from your family about their departure or your arrangements. Have you tried calling them directly?" "Their phones are all going to voicemail." He nodded understanding, clearly recognizing the gravity of the situation. "Let me contact our security team. Sometimes there are issues with room charges or other complications that require families to leave unexpectedly. There might be a perfectly reasonable explanation. But even as he spoke, I could see in his eyes that he was thinking the same thing I was thinking. Reasonable explanations didn't involve three people simultaneously becoming unreachable and checking out of a hotel without informing the elderly family member they'd brought on the trip. The security consultation confirmed what I already knew in my heart. My family had left me, deliberately, methodically, completely. They had made a conscious decision to abandon me at Disney World on my 80th birthday and then disappeared, without explanation or apology. The security officer, a woman whose professional demeanor couldn't quite mask her obvious distress at the situation, reviewed the hotel's records with me in a private office behind the front desk. The facts were stark and undeniable. David, Sarah, and Emma had checked out at 10:47 p.m. the previous evening. They had paid all outstanding charges, collected their belongings, and left the property in a rental car that had been returned to the airport early this morning. There was no indication of any emergency, no record of urgent phone calls or unexpected developments that might have forced their sudden departure. They had simply decided to leave, and they had done so without any regard for the elderly woman they'd brought here to celebrate what they'd claimed was an important family milestone. "Ma'am," the security officer said gently, "do you have any way to get home? Your own transportation arrangements?" The question forced me to confront the practical reality of my situation. I had a flight scheduled for 4 p.m., but that was hours away. I was stranded in a hotel with no family, no immediate support system, and a growing realization that the people I'd trusted most in the world had betrayed me in the most callous way imaginable. "I have a flight this afternoon," I managed to say, though my voice sounded strange and distant even to my own ears. "Would you like us to help you change that to an earlier flight? Or perhaps we could arrange for you to stay in the room until your departure time?" Their kindness was overwhelming, these strangers who were showing me more consideration than my own family had managed. The irony wasn't lost on me that Disney employees, people whose job was customer service, were treating me with more dignity and respect than the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. "The room would be wonderful, thank you." The security officer made some calls, spoke to managers I couldn't see, arranged things I couldn't quite follow. But the end result was that I was allowed to remain in my room until checkout time, giving me a private space to process what had happened and figure out how to move forward. Back in the elevator, heading up to the room that had felt like a temporary haven just hours earlier, I tried to make sense of what had occurred. What could possibly have motivated David, Sarah, and Emma to abandon me so completely? What kind of emergency or crisis could have justified such extreme action? But even as I searched for rational explanations, I knew in my heart that this wasn't about emergencies or crises. This was about something far more fundamental, far more devastating. This was about how my family really saw me, what I really meant to them, and how little consideration they thought I deserved. In my room, I sat on the bed that housekeeping had already made with military precision and tried to call David one more time. The phone rang and rang before going to voicemail, his professional greeting mocking me with its promise to return calls promptly. "David, it's your mother. I'm at the hotel, and I'm very confused about what happened. The front desk says you checked out last night, but we were supposed to have breakfast together this morning. Please call me back and let me know that you're all safe. I'm worried about all of you." I kept my voice calm and measured, refusing to let the hurt and anger creep into my words. Even now, even after being abandoned so cruelly, I was more concerned about their well-being than my own dignity. The realization made me angry at myself as much as at them. I tried Emma's phone again, thinking that perhaps she might be more likely to respond, that her natural kindness might override whatever decision her parents had made. But her voicemail greeting, recorded in happier times, only made the situation more heartbreaking. "Hi, you've reached Emma. I'm probably at school or hanging out with friends. but leave a message and I'll call you back as soon as I can." The cheerful optimism in her voice, the assumption that people who called her actually wanted to hear from her, was such a stark contrast to my current reality that I couldn't bring myself to leave a message. Sarah's phone continued going straight to voicemail, which suggested she'd turned it off entirely. Perhaps she'd anticipated my calls and decided to avoid them altogether. As the morning stretched into afternoon, I found myself moving through a strange emotional landscape that I'd never experienced before. I'd been through heartbreak when my husband died. I'd faced financial stress when David was young and money was tight. I'd dealt with loneliness, disappointment, illness, and loss. But I'd never been deliberately betrayed by the people I loved. Most never had my trust violated so completely and callously. The practical implications of my situation were manageable. I had my credit cards, my identification, my return flight. I could get home safely and resume my normal life without any real hardship. The emotional implications, however, were devastating in ways I was only beginning to understand. At some point during that long, surreal day, I realized I needed to call someone. Not my family, who had made their position clear through their actions, but someone who could help me process what had happened and figure out what came next. I called my financial advisor, a woman named Margaret Thornton who had been managing my investments for the past 15 years. We had a relationship that went beyond the purely professional. She'd been my confidant through various life challenges, my sounding board for major decisions, my trusted advisor on matters both financial and personal. "Rachel, how was Disney World? Did you have a magical time?" Her enthusiasm was so genuine, so warm, that I nearly broke down completely. Here was someone who remembered that I'd gone on this trip, who cared enough to ask about my experience, who assumed that I'd been treated with the love and respect I deserved. "Margaret, I need to talk to you about some things, some changes I want to make." Something in my voice must have alerted her to the gravity of the situation, because her tone immediately shifted from casual friendliness to professional concern. "Of course, what's going on?" I told her everything. The previous day's gradual deterioration, the growing sense that I was more burdened than beloved family member, the discovery that they'd abandoned me without explanation or apology. I tried to stick to facts rather than interpretations, but even the bare chronology of events painted a picture that was impossible to misinterpret. Margaret listened without interruption, occasionally making small sounds of sympathy or outrage, but mostly just letting me tell the story that I needed to tell. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Rachel, I'm so sorry. This is absolutely inexcusable behavior. I keep thinking there must be some explanation, some emergency I don't know about." "Even if there was an emergency, there's no excuse for not communicating with you. You don't just abandon an 80-year-old family member without explanation." Her outrage on my behalf was validating in a way I desperately needed. I'd been questioning my own reactions, wondering if I was being overly sensitive or unrealistic in my expectations. But Margaret's immediate recognition that this behavior was unacceptable helped me trust my own judgment. "I've been thinking about some changes I want to make," I said finally. "To my will, to my financial arrangements, things I've been putting off." "What kind of changes?" I'd been considering these modifications for months, even before the Disney trip. Questions about legacy, about what happened to wealth when it was inherited by people who might not appreciate its real value, about the difference between providing for family and enabling their worst impulses. "I want to restructure everything. Set up a foundation maybe. Make sure my money goes to people who will actually value it and use it wisely." Margaret understood immediately what I was really saying. She'd seen the investment statements, knew exactly how much money we were talking about. She also knew my family well enough to understand the implications of my decision. "Are you sure, Rachel? This is a major change, and you're dealing with a lot of emotional trauma right now. Maybe we should wait a few days. let you process what's happened. I'm sure. What happened yesterday and today didn't create these concerns. It just clarified them. I've been watching my family's relationship with money and success for years, and I've been worried about what would happen if they knew the truth about my financial situation. The truth was something that only Margaret and I fully understood. The modest lifestyle I'd maintained, the careful spending habits, the simple clothes and practical choices, none of it reflected financial necessity. All of it reflected deliberate choices about how I wanted to live and what values I wanted to model. My late husband had been more than just a loving partner. He'd been a brilliant investor with an instinct for identifying opportunities that others missed. When he died, he'd left me with investments that had grown exponentially over the decades since his death. My careful reinvestment strategy, guided by Margaret's expertise, had turned substantial wealth into extraordinary wealth. The Disney stock alone, purchased in the 1970s when the company was struggling and everyone thought theme parks were a fading fad, was now worth more than most people could imagine. Add in the technology investments, the real estate acquisitions, the diversified portfolio that had been carefully managed through decades of market fluctuations, and the total sum was genuinely staggering. But I'd never wanted my wealth to define my relationships or corrupt my family's values. I'd lived simply not because I had to, but because I believed in the importance of humility, gratitude, and hard work. I'd wanted David to build his own success, to develop his own character, without the safety net of inherited wealth undermining his motivation. Now, however, I was beginning to question whether my strategy had been wise. Instead of developing appreciation for what they had and compassion for those who had less, my family seemed to have developed a sense of entitlement and a casual disregard for people they perceived as having nothing to offer them. The way they'd treated me at Disney World, the gradual shift from genuine affection to barely concealed impatience, suggested that they saw me as a burden rather than a treasure. If that's how they treated me when they thought I was a woman of modest means, how would they treat others in similar circumstances? More importantly, what would they do with significant wealth if it was handed to them without having been earned? Would it make them more generous, more compassionate, more aware of their blessings? Or would it simply amplify the worst aspects of their current personalities? I want to set up a foundation focused on supporting elderly people who've been abandoned by their families, I told Margaret. There have to be others in situations like mine, people whose children see them as inconveniences rather than individuals deserving of respect and care. Margaret's voice was warm with approval. That's a beautiful legacy, Rachel. And given your current situation, probably a very timely one. We talked for another hour about the practical aspects of such a restructuring, the legal requirements, the tax implications, the timeline for implementation. But more than the technical details, I found comfort in having a plan, a way to transform my personal pain into something that might help others facing similar challenges. By the time I ended the call, I felt calmer than I had since discovering my family's betrayal. I still hurt. That deep, aching pain of broken trust wasn't going to disappear overnight. But I also felt empowered, purposeful, determined to make sure that something positive emerged from this devastating experience. The afternoon dragged by slowly, each hour bringing me closer to my departure time, but no closer to any contact from my family. I tried their phones periodically, more out of habit than hope, but the result was always the same. David's professional voicemail, Emma's cheerful greeting, Sarah's phone going directly to an automated message. They had made their choice, and they were sticking to it. As I packed my belongings, folding the simple clothes I'd brought for what was supposed to be a joyful family celebration, I found the Mickey Mouse ears Emma had insisted I wear for photos. They looked silly and pathetic now, a symbol of my naive belief that my family's love was unconditional and enduring. But I packed them carefully anyway. Not as a memento of a happy time, but as a reminder of an important lesson. A reminder that trust must be earned and that love can be conditional in ways you never expect. A reminder that sometimes the people who claim to care about you the most are the ones most capable of devastating betrayal. The shuttle ride to the airport was filled with other families, other grandparents saying tearful goodbyes to grandchildren, other elderly people being treated with the respect and consideration I'd foolishly expected from my own family. I watched these interactions with a mixture of longing and cynicism, wondering how many of these apparently loving relationships would survive the kind of stress test my own family had failed so spectacularly. At the airport, I finally received a text message. Not from David or Emma, but from Sarah, sent from a number I didn't recognize. Emergency came up. Had to leave early. Hope you got home safely. That was it. No apology, no explanation, no acknowledgement that abandoning an 80-year-old family member without warning might have been inappropriate. Just a brief, impersonal message that read more like a business communication than a note from a daughter-in-law to her husband's mother. I stared at the message for a long time, trying to decode some hidden meaning, some indication that there was more to this story than appeared on the surface. But the clinical brevity of the communication told me everything I needed to know about how they viewed me and what they thought I deserved. On the plane, as Florida disappeared beneath the clouds and I flew back to my quiet life in a completely different emotional state than I'd left it, I thought about the phone call I'd need to make to Margaret in the morning. We had a foundation to establish, legal documents to draft, a legacy to create that would honor the values I'd tried to live by rather than enabling the selfishness I'd witnessed in my own family. I thought about the elderly people who might benefit from the resources I'd accumulated, people who had been discarded and forgotten by families who should have treasured them. People who, like me, had discovered that blood relationships don't guarantee love, loyalty, or basic human decency. Most of all, I thought about Emma, the granddaughter I'd adored, who had participated in this betrayal despite all the love and attention I'd showered on her over the years. That betrayal hurt more than all the others combined, because I'd believed so completely in the goodness of her heart and the strength of our connection. But perhaps that was naive too. Perhaps at 14, Emma was already more her parents' daughter than I'd wanted to acknowledge. Perhaps the values I'd hoped to instill in her had been overwhelmed by the materialism and selfishness she witnessed at home every day. The plane touched down in my home city just as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades that reminded me of the Florida sunrise I'd watched on my birthday morning. That felt like a lifetime ago now, though it had been less than 48 hours. Amazing how quickly a life could change, how rapidly trust could be shattered, how efficiently love could transform into something much more complicated and painful. But as I collected my luggage and made my way through the familiar airport, I realized that despite everything that had happened, I wasn't broken. Hurt, yes. Disappointed beyond measure, absolutely. But not broken. I was 80 years old, and I'd survived worse than this. I'd survived the death of my husband, the challenges of single motherhood, decades of careful financial management and strategic decision-making. I'd built a life of purpose and meaning, and I'd accumulated resources that could make a real difference in the world. My family's betrayal had taught me something important about their character, but it had also clarified something important about my own values and priorities. I knew now what mattered most to me, and it wasn't the approval or affection of people who could abandon me so easily. It was the opportunity to use my resources wisely, to create something lasting and meaningful, to ensure that other elderly people wouldn't face the kind of abandonment I'd experienced. It was the chance to build a legacy based on compassion, rather than blood, on earned respect rather than assumed obligation. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of transforming my pain into purpose. Tonight, I would simply be grateful to be home, safe, and free from the illusion that my family's love was something I could count on. The truth, as painful as it was, had set me free in ways I was only beginning to understand. The silence in my house felt different when I returned from Florida, It wasn't the comfortable solitude I'd grown accustomed to over the years, the peaceful quiet of a woman content with her own company. This was a heavier silence, weighted with betrayal and the echo of voices that would never sound quite the same to me again. I moved through my evening routine mechanically, unpacking clothes that still smelled faintly of Disney's signature scent, placing the unworn Mickey Mouse ears in a drawer where I wouldn't have to look at them every day. My house, which had always felt like a sanctuary, now seemed like a museum of my own naivety. Photographs of family gatherings where everyone was smiling, gifts from grandchildren who apparently valued me less than I'd believed, mementos of a relationship I'd thought was built on mutual love and respect. That first night back, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Emma's face as she danced with Goofy, heard David's voice promising that today would be perfect, felt the weight of Sarah's distracted hugs that I'd interpreted as affection rather than obligation. The memories that should have been treasures had become instruments of torture, each one highlighting how completely I'd misunderstood my place in their lives. By morning, I'd made peace with my sleeplessness and decided to channel my restless energy into action. I called Margaret at precisely 9 a.m., knowing she'd be in her office and prepared to discuss the legal complexities of restructuring a substantial estate. "Rachel, how are you holding up? I've been thinking about you all night." Her genuine concern was a balm to my wounded spirit. Here was someone who barely knew my family, yet was more concerned about my well-being than the people who'd raised me, lived with me, claimed to love me. "I'm ready to move forward with the changes we discussed. How quickly can we make this happen?" "We can start immediately, but Rachel, I have to ask. Have you heard anything from them? Any explanation? Or apology?" I'd checked my phone obsessively throughout the night, hoping against hope that someone would reach out, would offer some reasonable explanation for their behavior. Instead, I'd found a handful of promotional texts from retailers and a robocall about extending my car warranty. Nothing. Sarah sent a single text saying there was an emergency and they had to leave early. No details, no apology, no concern for how I was getting home or whether I was safe. Margaret's intake of breath was audible. "That's unconscionable. Rachel, whatever their emergency was, there's no excuse for treating you that way." We spent the next hour discussing the mechanics of establishing the Rachel Young Foundation for Elderly Dignity. Margaret had clearly spent considerable time researching similar charitable organizations, and she walked me through various options for structuring the foundation to maximize its impact while minimizing administrative overhead. "I want to start with a substantial initial endowment," I told her. "Enough to make a real difference immediately, not something that will take years to build momentum." "What kind of number are you thinking?" I'd been calculating figures in my head throughout the sleepless night, weighing my desire to create something meaningful against my practical need to maintain my own financial security. $50 million to start. More later, depending on how things develop. The silence on Margaret's end stretched long enough that I wondered if we'd been disconnected. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a mixture of admiration and concern. "Rachel, that's incredibly generous, but it's also a significant portion of your liquid assets. Are you certain you want to commit that much immediately?" I understood her caution. $50 million was real money, even in the context of my overall wealth. But I'd lived comfortably on far less for decades, and the investment returns alone would continue to generate more money than I could spend in my remaining years. "I'm certain. I've spent my entire adult life accumulating wealth that I never really needed. Now I want to use it for something that matters." "And your family? Have you considered how they might react when they discover what you've done?" The question struck at the heart of something I'd been avoiding thinking about directly. My family's abandonment had been devastating, but it had also been illuminating. They'd shown me exactly how much I meant to them when they thought I had nothing to offer. What would happen when they discovered I'd had something to offer all along but had chosen to give it to strangers instead of to them? They made their choice when they left me stranded at Disney World. Now I'm making mine. Margaret and I scheduled a meeting for the following afternoon to begin the formal paperwork. She recommended an attorney who specialized in charitable foundations, a woman named Janet Pierce who had helped establish some of the most successful philanthropic organizations in the state. By the time I hung up the phone, I felt purposeful for the first time since returning home. But the silence of my house soon reasserted itself, and with it came a tide of memories I couldn't entirely suppress. I found myself walking through rooms, filled with tokens of my relationship with my family, each object now carrying a different emotional weight than it had just a week earlier. The refrigerator was covered with Emma's artwork from when she was younger, colorful drawings of stick figure, families where Grandma Rachel always stood proudly in the center. I stared at one particular picture, created when Emma was maybe 7 years old, showing all of us holding hands under a rainbow with "I love my family" written in uneven purple letters across the top. Had she meant it then? Had there been a time when her love was genuine, unconditional, free from the calculations that seemed to govern her parents' behavior? Or had I been projecting my own feelings onto a child who was simply doing what children do, creating art that would please the adults around her? The living room mantel displayed photographs spanning decades of family gatherings, birthday parties, holidays, graduations, casual weekend visits. In every single picture, I was beaming with joy, radiating the kind of happiness that comes from believing you're surrounded by people who treasure you as much as you treasure them. But looking at those same photos now, I began to notice things I'd missed before. David's smiles, which had always seemed genuine to me, now appeared slightly strained in some of the more recent pictures. Sarah's body language, which I'd interpreted as reserved politeness, might actually have been barely concealed impatience. Even Emma, in the photos from the last few years, seemed to be performing happiness rather than experiencing it naturally. Had I been blind to their true feelings all along? Had my desire to believe in their love prevented me from seeing signs that should have been obvious? Or was I now reinterpreting innocent expressions through the lens of my recent betrayal? The questions tormented me because they challenged not just my understanding of recent events, but my entire perception of my relationships with the people I'd loved most. If I'd been wrong about their feelings toward me, what else had I been wrong about? How many other assumptions about my life and relationships were built on foundations of sand? I decided I needed to get out of the house, to escape the oppressive weight of memories and questions that had no satisfying answers. I drove to the small cafe downtown where I'd been having coffee and reading newspapers for the past 15 years, hoping that the familiar routine would provide some measure of comfort. The barista, a young woman named Jessica who'd been working there since she was in high school, greeted me with her usual enthusiasm. "Mrs. Young, how was your big birthday trip? I've been dying to hear about Disney World." The genuine interest in her voice, the way she remembered not just that I'd gone on a trip, but that it was for my birthday, highlighted the contrast between her casual kindness and my family's deliberate cruelty. Here was someone who barely knew me yet cared enough to ask about my experiences and remember important details about my life. It was educational, I said finally, not wanting to burden this sweet young woman with the details of my family's betrayal, but also unable to pretend that everything had been magical. Jessica's expression shifted, her natural empathy picking up on the careful neutrality in my voice. "Oh no. Was it not as fun as you expected? Sometimes these big family trips can be stressful." "Something like that. But I'm glad I went. I learned some important things about myself and the people around me." She nodded, understanding, her eyes conveying a wisdom that seemed beyond her years. Sometimes the most important trips are the ones that don't go according to plan. They teach us things we need to know, even when we don't want to learn them. I ordered my usual coffee and found a quiet table by the window where I could watch the morning foot traffic while processing my thoughts. The cafe was filled with the kind of comfortable bustle that characterized small businesses in small towns. Regulars chatting with staff about their families and weekend plans. Strangers finding temporary community over shared appreciation for good coffee and homemade pastries. Sitting in that familiar environment, surrounded by the gentle hum of human connection and casual kindness, I began to gain some perspective on my situation. Yes, my family had betrayed me in a devastating way. Yes, I was hurt and angry and disillusioned about relationships I'd believed were unshakable. But I was also surrounded by evidence that decent, caring people existed in the world, people who treated others with basic respect and consideration, even when they had nothing to gain from doing. So, Jessica had remembered my birthday trip and asked about it with genuine interest. The Disney employees had shown me more courtesy and concern when I was stranded than my own family had managed during our entire vacation. Margaret was working to help me transform my pain into purpose, using her expertise to ensure my wealth would serve meaningful goals rather than enabling destructive behavior. Perhaps the lesson I needed to learn wasn't that people were fundamentally selfish and untrustworthy, but that I needed to be more discerning about where I placed my trust and how I defined family. Blood relationships didn't guarantee love or loyalty, but neither did they preclude the possibility of finding those qualities in unexpected places. By the time I finished my coffee, I felt calmer and more focused than I had since returning from Florida. I had important work to do, meaningful decisions to make, a legacy to create that would outlast the temporary pain of familial betrayal. The foundation wasn't just about helping other elderly people who'd been abandoned. It was about reclaiming my own sense of purpose and agency in a world that had suddenly become far more complicated than I'd expected. That afternoon, I met with Margaret and Janet Pierce in Margaret's office. Janet was exactly the kind of woman I'd hoped she would be. Competent, passionate about her work, clearly committed to using her legal expertise to help people create positive change in the world. She listened to my story without judgment, asked thoughtful questions about my goals for the foundation, and outlined a timeline for establishing the organization that was both ambitious and realistic. The Rachel Young Foundation for Elderly. Dignity is a beautiful mission, she said as we concluded our initial consultation. There's a real need for services that specifically address the isolation and abandonment that many elderly people experience. Your foundation could fill gaps that government programs and other charities aren't adequately addressing. We discussed the practical aspects of running a charitable organization: board governance, grant-making procedures, administrative oversight, performance metrics. But more than the operational details, I found comfort in Janet's obvious enthusiasm for the project. She wasn't just helping me establish a tax-deductible way to give away money. She was helping me create an institution that could make a genuine difference in people's lives. I'd like to include provisions for emergency assistance, I told them. Direct financial support for elderly people who find themselves in crisis situations through no fault of their own. People who've been abandoned or exploited or forgotten by the systems and families that should protect them. Margaret nodded approvingly. That's a wonderful idea, Rachel. Reactive giving is important, but so is proactive support for people in immediate need. By the time I left their office, we had a concrete plan for establishing the foundation within 60 days. The initial $50 million endowment would be transferred from my investment accounts. The legal documentation would be filed with appropriate state and federal agencies, and we'd begin the process of identifying grant recipients and emergency assistance cases. For the first time since my return from Disney World, I felt genuinely excited about the future. Yes, I'd lost something precious in discovering my family's true feelings toward me. But I'd also gained something valuable: clarity about my own values and priorities, freedom from relationships built on false assumptions, and the opportunity to create something meaningful with the resources I'd accumulated over a lifetime of careful stewardship. That evening, I decided to call my neighbor Mrs. Henderson, an 83-year-old widow who lived alone in the house next to mine. We'd been casual friends for years, sharing the occasional cup of tea and comparing notes on gardening techniques, but we'd never had what you'd call a deep personal relationship. Tonight, however, I felt drawn to connect with someone who might understand the complexities of aging in a world that often discounted the value and dignity of elderly people. Rachel, how lovely to hear from you. How was your big Disney trip? With the family? The question I'd been dreading had become easier to answer with practice. It was enlightening, Marjorie. Not quite what I expected, but definitely educational. Oh dear, that doesn't sound entirely positive. Family trips can be complicated, can't they? All those different personalities and expectations trying to coexist in one hotel room. Something like that. Actually, I was calling because I wanted to ask you about something. Have you ever felt like your family sees you more as an obligation than as a person they genuinely want to spend time with? The silence that followed my question was long enough that I wondered if I'd overstepped some boundary of appropriate, neighborly conversation. But when Marjorie finally responded, her voice carried a weight of understanding that told me I'd found someone who could relate to my situation. Oh, Rachel, I think most of us reach a point where we start questioning whether our children love us or simply tolerate us out of duty. It's one of the cruelest aspects of aging. Watching relationships you thought were based on genuine affection reveal themselves to be more complicated than you realized. How do you handle it? The disappointment, I mean. I try to focus on the relationships that are genuine rather than dwelling on the ones that aren't. My daughter calls me every week, but I can tell she's usually multitasking while we talk, checking email or making grocery lists. My grandson, on the other hand, stops by every few weeks just to chat, with no agenda other than spending time together. I've learned to appreciate him more and expect less from her. Marjorie's wisdom resonated with something deep in my chest, a recognition that she'd articulated a truth I was still struggling to accept. Not all relationships were created equal, and expecting the same level of genuine care from everyone who claimed to love you was a recipe for disappointment. The hardest part is adjusting your expectations, she continued. When you realize that someone you thought treasured your company actually finds it burdensome, you have to grieve the relationship you thought you had before you can appreciate whatever relationship actually exists. We talked for another hour, sharing stories and insights about the challenges of maintaining dignity and purpose in a culture that often treated elderly people as inconveniences to be managed rather than individuals to be respected. By the time we said goodbye, I felt less alone with my disillusionment and more hopeful about finding meaningful connections with people who valued authenticity over obligation. Over the following weeks, I threw myself into the foundation work, with an energy and focus I hadn't experienced in years. Janet and Margaret guided me through the legal and financial complexities of establishing a charitable organization, but the creative and strategic aspects of the project were entirely mine to develop. I researched existing programs for elderly support, identifying gaps in services that my foundation could address. I contacted social workers, elder care advocates, and nonprofit leaders to better understand the scope of abandonment and abuse that elderly people faced. I visited nursing homes and senior centers, talking with residents about their experiences with family relationships and their hopes for support and connection. The stories I heard were heartbreaking but also inspiring. I met women whose children had moved across the country and rarely called, men whose families visited only when they needed money, people who'd been placed in care facilities and forgotten by relatives who'd once claimed to love them unconditionally. But I also met individuals who'd found new purposes in their later years, who'd created chosen families from friends and community connections, who'd learned to value their own company and pursue interests they'd never had time for when they were focused on pleasing others. One woman in particular, a 78-year-old named Dorothy Chen, became something of a mentor to me during this period. She'd been abandoned by her son and daughter-in-law after they'd convinced her to sell her house and move closer to them, then decided her presence was too disruptive to their lifestyle. Instead of becoming bitter, Dorothy had used her experience to become an advocate for other elderly people facing similar situations. "The worst part isn't the abandonment itself," Dorothy told me during one of our conversations at a senior center where she volunteered. "It's the way it makes you question everything you believed about love and family and your own worth. You start wondering if you were a terrible parent, if you did something to deserve this treatment, if you've been deluding yourself about your relationships for decades." Her words captured exactly what I'd been experiencing since my return from Disney World: the self-doubt that accompanied the heartbreak, the way betrayal made you question not just the people who'd hurt you, but your own judgment and worthiness. "How did you move past that?" I asked. "I realized that their treatment of me said everything about their character and nothing about my value as a human being. I raised my son to be kind, responsible, and compassionate. If he chose to become selfish and callous instead, that's a reflection of his failures, not mine." Dorothy's clarity and strength inspired me to examine my own situation with less self-recrimination and more objective analysis. I'd been a devoted mother to David, providing him with love, support, and opportunities despite significant financial limitations. I'd been a loving grandmother to Emma, always making time for her interests and concerns, always treating her with respect and affection. I'd been polite and accommodating with Sarah, despite our personality differences and occasional tensions. Their decision to abandon me at Disney World said everything about their capacity for cruelty and nothing about my worthiness of love and respect. I needed to stop questioning my own value and start questioning theirs. As the foundation paperwork moved through its various approval processes, I found myself thinking more about my family's potential reaction to discovering what they'd lost through their betrayal. The $50 million I was committing to the foundation was just the beginning. My total estate was worth far more than they could have imagined, and none of it was going to them anymore. Part of me felt guilty about the satisfaction this knowledge brought me. I'd never been a vindictive person, never found pleasure in other people's pain or disappointment. But there was something deeply satisfying about knowing that David, Sarah, and Emma would eventually discover that the elderly woman they'd discarded so casually had actually been capable of transforming their financial futures, and that their callousness had cost them more than they could have calculated. I wasn't changing my will out of spite, though. I was doing it because their behavior had revealed fundamental character flaws that made them unsuitable stewards of significant wealth. Money didn't create character, but it definitely amplified existing traits. David's tendency toward selfishness, Sarah's focus on appearances over substance, Emma's apparent willingness to participate in cruelty when it served her convenience. These weren't qualities I wanted to reward with financial windfalls. The foundation, on the other hand, would use my money to serve people who'd been overlooked and undervalued, people who understood the true meaning of dignity and resilience. It would create lasting change in the world rather than simply enabling the comfortable lifestyles of people who'd already demonstrated their inability to appreciate what they had. 6 weeks after my return from Disney World, I still hadn't heard a single word from any member of my family. No apology, no explanation, no inquiry about my well-being. The silence was deafening in its completeness, a clear indication that their abandonment hadn't been a momentary lapse in judgment, but a deliberate decision they felt entirely comfortable maintaining. The foundation paperwork was nearing completion. The initial endowment was ready to be transferred, and I was preparing to announce the organization's launch to local media outlets. Once that happened, there would be no hiding the scope of my philanthropic activities or the wealth that made them possible. I wondered how long it would take for news of the Rachel Young Foundation for Elderly Dignity to reach my family's attention. I wondered how they'd react when they realized what they'd lost through their cruelty. Most of all, I wondered if they'd finally reach out, not out of love or concern for my well-being, but out of desperate recognition of their catastrophic mistake. But by then, it would be far too late for apologies or explanations. By then, I'd have moved beyond their capacity to hurt me and into a new chapter of my life where my worth wasn't dependent on their approval or affection. The knowledge that this reckoning was coming filled me with a complex mixture of emotions: sadness for what we'd all lost, satisfaction at the justice of it, and hope for the meaningful work I was about to begin. My 80th birthday had marked the end of one phase of my life and the beginning of another. One where I finally understood the difference between being loved and being tolerated, between genuine relationships and convenient obligations. It was a harsh lesson, but it was also a liberating one. And soon, very soon, the people who'd taught it to me were going to learn some difficult lessons of their own. The Rachel Young Foundation for Elderly Dignity officially launched on a crisp October morning, exactly 2 months after my abandoned 80th birthday celebration. The local newspaper ran a front-page story about the $50 million endowment, complete with a photograph of me standing in front of the modest office building that would serve as our headquarters. The reporter, a young woman named Amanda Reeves, had done her homework thoroughly, detailing not just the foundation's mission, but also the personal story that had inspired its creation. I'd been careful in my interview with Amanda, sharing enough of my Disney World experience to explain my motivation without descending into bitterness or self-pity. The story focused on my commitment to supporting elderly people who'd been marginalized or abandoned, emphasizing the Foundation's proactive approach to addressing gaps in existing support systems. But anyone reading between the lines could understand that this wasn't abstract philanthropy. It was deeply personal advocacy born from lived experience. The response to the article was immediate and overwhelming. My phone began ringing before I'd finished my morning coffee, with calls from social workers, elder care advocates, and elderly individuals who'd read about the foundation and wanted to share their own stories. By noon, I'd received more than 40 messages from people expressing gratitude for the foundation's mission and offering to volunteer their time and expertise. But the call that changed everything came at 2:15 in the afternoon, just as I was preparing to leave for a meeting with potential board members. David's name appeared on my phone screen, the first time I'd seen it there since our abandoned breakfast plans at Disney World. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail. Part of me wanted to maintain the silence they'd imposed, to let them experience the uncertainty and abandonment they'd inflicted on me. But curiosity won out over dignity, and I answered on the 4th ring. "Hello, David." "Mom." His voice sounded strange, tight with emotions I couldn't immediately identify. "I just saw the newspaper article about your foundation." "Ah, I wondered when you might notice that." $50 million, Mom? Where did you get $50 million? The question revealed so much about how little he actually knew about my life, my circumstances, my carefully managed financial situation. For decades, he'd assumed that my modest lifestyle reflected modest means, never questioning whether there might be more to my story than what appeared on the surface. "I've been financially comfortable for quite some time, David. Your father left me very well provided for, and I've been a careful investor over the years. But $50 million. That's not comfortable, Mom. That's wealthy. That's really wealthy." I could hear the calculation in his voice, the wheels turning as he tried to reconcile this new information with everything he thought he knew about his mother's financial situation. Behind his shock, I detected something else, a growing awareness of what his family's behavior at Disney World might have cost them. Yes, it is. And it's money I've chosen to dedicate to helping elderly people who've been abandoned by their families. People like me. The silence that followed was heavy with implications. David wasn't stupid. He understood exactly what I was telling him and why I was telling him this way. But understanding and accepting were very different things. "Mom, about Disney World. I know we left things in a confusing way. Sarah had this work crisis and everything happened so fast. David, you checked out of the hotel at 10:47 p.m. on my birthday, leaving me stranded without a word of explanation or goodbye. You turned off your phones and disappeared. There was no confusion about it. It was deliberate abandonment. It wasn't like that. We had to catch an early flight and we didn't want to wake you. We thought you'd understand. The lie was so transparent, so insulting to my intelligence that I almost laughed. Did he really think I was naive enough to believe that checking out secretly in the middle of the night was an act of consideration, rather than cruelty? David, I'm 80 years old, not senile. You abandoned me because spending time with me had become inconvenient, and you thought I was just a poor elderly woman who would have to accept whatever treatment you chose to give me. You were wrong about my circumstances, and you were wrong about my willingness to tolerate disrespect. Mom, please, let us make this right. We can explain everything if you'll just give us a chance. The desperation creeping into his voice confirmed what I'd suspected. This call wasn't motivated by concern for my feelings or genuine remorse for their behavior. It was motivated by panic over what their cruelty might have cost them financially. Make it right? David, you left me alone at Disney World on my 80th birthday without explanation or apology. You've had 2 months to reach out, to check on my well-being, to offer some kind of acknowledgement of your behavior. Instead, you maintained complete silence until you discovered I have money. What exactly are you planning to make right? We've been busy, Mom. Work has been crazy, and Emma started high school, and everything just got away from us. Too busy to send a single text message asking if I made it home safely? Too busy to call on a random Tuesday just to see how I was doing, but not too busy to call within hours of discovering I'm wealthy? The conversation was becoming increasingly surreal. David seemed genuinely surprised that I was angry, as if abandoning an elderly family member was a minor social faux pas rather than a devastating betrayal. His focus remained entirely on explaining away their behavior rather than acknowledging the pain they'd caused. Look, Mom, we obviously need to sit down and talk about this properly. All of us together. Can we come over this weekend? We can clear the air and figure out how to move forward. Move forward toward what, David? Toward being a family again. Toward understanding each other better. Toward making sure you're making good decisions about your finances. There it was. The real motivation behind his sudden interest in reconciliation. Not love, not guilt, not genuine remorse for their behavior. Fear that I might give away money they'd assumed would eventually be theirs. David, I want you to listen to me very carefully. The $50 million I've given to the foundation is just the beginning. My total estate is worth considerably more than that, and none of it is going to you, Sarah, or Emma. Your behavior at Disney World made it clear that you don't value me as a person, and your call today confirms that you only value me as a potential source of inheritance. Mom, that's not fair. We love you. We've always loved you. If this is what your love looks like, I'm better off without it. Please don't make any hasty decisions. You're upset, and I understand why, but don't do something you'll regret later. The condescension in his voice, the implication that my decisions were emotional rather than rational, crystallized everything I'd come to understand about how my family really saw me. Even now, even after discovering the scope of my wealth and the consequences of their cruelty, David couldn't bring himself to treat me as an intelligent adult capable of making sound judgments. David, I'm going to hang up now. If you'd like to have a relationship with me going forward, it will be based on genuine respect and affection, not on what you think you might inherit. But given your family's demonstrated capacity for abandonment, when things become inconvenient, I'm not optimistic about your ability to sustain that kind of authentic connection. Mom, wait. I ended the call and immediately turned off my phone. My hands were shaking slightly, whether from anger or adrenaline, or simply the emotional weight of finally confronting the reality I'd been avoiding for months. But underneath, the trembling was a profound sense of relief. I'd said what needed to be said, made my position clear, and refused to allow David to manipulate me with false promises of reconciliation. The meeting with potential board members went better than I'd hoped. Dr. Jennifer Martinez, a retired geriatrician who'd spent 40 years advocating for elderly patients, brought a wealth of clinical experience and policy expertise. Robert Chen, Dorothy's son who'd somehow managed to avoid inheriting his mother's abandonment issues, offered insights from his work in nonprofit management. Susan Walsh, a social worker who specialized in elder abuse cases, provided gritty, real-world perspective on the challenges we'd be addressing. During the meeting, I shared the broad outlines of my Disney World experience without dwelling on the personal details, focusing instead on how that experience had illuminated gaps in support systems for elderly people facing family crises. The board members understood immediately why this work mattered and brought their own stories of clients and patients who'd faced similar situations. The foundation isn't just about providing emergency financial assistance, Dr. Martinez observed. It's about affirming the dignity and value of elderly people in a culture that often treats them as burdens or irrelevancies. Exactly. I want every grant recipient, every person we help, to understand that they matter as individuals, that their experiences and wisdom have value, that abandonment by family doesn't diminish their worth as human beings. By the time we concluded the meeting, we'd established the framework for grant-making procedures, emergency assistance protocols, and community outreach programs. More importantly, we'd created a shared vision for what the foundation could accomplish beyond simply distributing money. We were building an organization that would challenge societal assumptions about aging and family obligations. That evening, as I was reviewing notes from the board meeting, my phone rang again. This time it was Sarah, calling from what appeared to be a different number than the one I had stored for her. "Rachel, we need to talk." No greeting, no pleasantries, no acknowledgement of the months of silence that had preceded this conversation. Just a demand for attention that assumed I would be available whenever she decided I was worth her time. "Hello, Sarah. I was wondering when I might hear from you." "This foundation thing, Rachel, it's a mistake. You're making decisions while you're emotional, and you're going to regret it later." "Emotional decisions?" "Sarah, I've been planning this foundation for months. I've consulted with attorneys, financial advisors, and philanthropic experts. I've researched existing programs and identified genuine needs in the community. This isn't an emotional reaction. It's a carefully considered response to discovering what my family really thinks of me." "That's not fair. We were dealing with a crisis at Disney World. Things got complicated and we made some mistakes in how we handled the situation." "What crisis, Sarah? What emergency was so urgent that it required you to abandon an 80-year-old woman without explanation or apology?" The pause that followed suggested she was struggling to construct a believable narrative for behavior that had no reasonable justification. There were work issues, client emergencies, things you wouldn't understand. The casual dismissiveness of her response, the assumption that I was too naive or elderly to comprehend the complexities of professional life, revealed everything about her attitude toward me. Even now, even when she needed something from me, Sarah couldn't bring herself to speak to me with basic respect. "Sarah, I spent 40 years managing my own financial affairs while raising a child as a single parent. I understand work pressures and professional obligations. What I don't understand is how those pressures justified checking out of a hotel secretly in the middle of the night and then maintaining complete silence for 2 months. Look, we made mistakes. We're human. But this foundation thing is an overreaction that's going to hurt everyone, including you." "Hurt everyone how?" "You're giving away money that should stay in the family. Money that could secure Emma's future, help her with college expenses, and getting started in life. You're punishing a 14-year-old girl for mistakes her parents made." The manipulation was so transparent, so calculated, that I felt a surge of anger unlike anything I'd experienced since returning from Disney World. Sarah was trying to use my love for Emma against me, weaponizing my affection for my granddaughter to override my judgment about her parents' character. Sarah, Emma participated in abandoning me just as deliberately as you and David did. She's old enough to understand right from wrong, and she chose wrong. The consequences of that choice are hers to bear. She's a child, Rachel. She was following her parents' lead. She's a teenager who knew exactly what was happening and said nothing to stop it. She hugged me goodbye that night knowing her family was planning to abandon me the next morning. That's not childish innocence. That's calculated deception. You're being unreasonable. Emma loves you. If that's what Emma's love looks like, she needs to learn better ways of expressing it. Maybe losing access to an inheritance she never earned will teach her to value relationships over money. This is insane, Rachel. You're destroying your family over a misunderstanding. I'm protecting myself from a family that's already destroyed. Our relationship through their behavior. The money just made the destruction visible. Sarah's voice took on a harder edge, dropping the pretense of concerned affection and revealing the calculation that had been there all along. You're making a huge mistake. David is your only child. Emma is your only grandchild. When you're really old and need help, when you're sick or dying, who do you think is going to be there for you? The threat was unmistakable. Support us financially, or face abandonment again when you're even more vulnerable. It was exactly the kind of emotional blackmail I might have expected from someone who'd already demonstrated her willingness to abandon family members when they became inconvenient. Sarah, you've already shown me exactly how much support I can expect from your family when I need help. You left me stranded at Disney World on my 80th birthday. If that's how you treat me when you think I'm poor, I can only imagine how. You'd treat me if you discovered I was actually wealthy and you were trying to protect your inheritance. That's not. We would never. You already did. And now you're calling not to apologize or make amends, but to try to manipulate me into giving you access to money you feel entitled to, despite having earned none of it. We're family. Rachel, family takes care of each other. You're absolutely right, Sarah. Family does take care of each other. That's why I'm so disappointed that you never learned that lesson. I ended the call and turned off my phone again, knowing that more calls would come, but feeling no obligation to subject myself to further manipulation attempts. The conversations with David and Sarah had confirmed everything I'd suspected about their motivations and clarified everything I'd questioned about my own decisions. Over the following days, the calls continued. David tried several more times, leaving increasingly desperate voicemails that alternated between apology and accusation. Sarah sent text messages that grew progressively more threatening, suggesting that I was suffering from dementia or being manipulated by unscrupulous advisors. Even Emma finally reached out, sending a brief text that read, "Grandma, please call me. I miss you and want to explain." But the time for explanations had passed. Their behavior at Disney World had revealed their true character, and their response to discovering my wealth had confirmed that their concern was entirely financial rather than emotional. Nothing they could say now would change the fundamental reality that they'd abandoned me when they thought I had nothing to offer them and were trying to reconcile only after discovering I had everything to offer them. The Foundation's first grants were announced in November, supporting programs that provided emergency assistance to elderly people facing housing crises, family abandonment, and financial abuse. The local media coverage was extensive and positive, highlighting specific cases where the Foundation's intervention had made meaningful differences in people's lives. One story in particular captured public attention. An 82-year-old man named Frank Delacroix had been evicted from his apartment by his son, who wanted to sell the property Frank had been living in rent-free for 15 years. Frank had no other family, limited financial resources, and nowhere to go. The Foundation's emergency assistance program had helped him secure temporary housing, while social workers found him a permanent placement in a senior community where he could maintain his independence and dignity. Frank's story resonated with readers because it illustrated how quickly elderly people could find themselves vulnerable and abandoned, even when they'd maintained good relationships with their families for decades. It also demonstrated how targeted financial assistance, combined with compassionate advocacy, could transform desperate situations into manageable transitions. The positive response to Frank's story generated additional donations to the foundation from community members who wanted to support similar interventions. Local businesses offered volunteer services and in-kind donations. Other elderly people reached out to share their own stories and express gratitude for an organization that recognized their worth and dignity. But the story that affected me most deeply came from an unexpected source. Dorothy Chen called me in early December to tell me about a conversation she'd had with her granddaughter, a college sophomore who'd read about the foundation in her campus newspaper. "She called me crying," Dorothy said, her voice filled with emotion. She said reading about the foundation made her realize how terribly her parents had treated me, and how wrong she'd been to go along with their decision to cut me out of their lives. She wants to rebuild our relationship, to learn from my experiences instead of dismissing them. "That's wonderful, Dorothy. I'm so happy for you." The point is, Rachel, sometimes our stories inspire people to examine their own behavior and make better choices. Your foundation isn't just helping elderly people directly. It's starting conversations about how we treat our aging family members and what we owe each other as human beings. Dorothy's insight reminded me that the foundation's impact extended beyond the individuals we served directly. By publicly affirming the dignity and value of elderly people, by challenging assumptions about family obligations and social responsibilities, we were contributing to broader cultural conversations about aging, respect, and community support. That same week, I received an unexpected visitor. Emma appeared at my front door on a Saturday afternoon, looking older than her 14 years, and clearly nervous about the conversation she'd come to have. "Grandma Rachel, can we talk?" I invited her in, offered her hot chocolate, and waited for her to find whatever words she'd rehearsed for this moment. She sat on my sofa, the same spot where she'd curled up countless times over the years while telling me about school dramas and teenage concerns that had seemed so important then. "I know you're angry with all of us," she began, her voice small and uncertain. "And I know we messed up really badly at Disney World." "Yes, you did. Mom and Dad said you're giving away all your money to strangers instead of keeping it in the family. They said you're trying to punish us. What do you think, Emma?" She was quiet for a long moment, clearly struggling with concepts that were too complex for easy answers. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a maturity I hadn't heard before. "I think you're trying to help people who need it. And I think Mom and Dad are more upset about the money than about hurting your feelings." Her honesty was refreshing after weeks of manipulation attempts from her parents, but it also revealed how much she'd absorbed about the family's real priorities, how clearly she understood the difference between genuine concern and financial anxiety. "Emma, what do you remember about our last night at Disney World?" "I remember Mom and Dad being really stressed about work stuff. I remember the fireworks being amazing. I remember you being sad that they weren't paying attention. Do you remember saying goodbye to me that night?" She nodded, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "I hugged you and told you I loved you, but I already knew we were leaving early the next morning without telling you." "And how did that make you feel?" "Terrible. I wanted to tell you, but Mom said it would just upset you and ruin the end of the trip. She said it would be better if you just found out in the morning when we were already gone." The revelation that Emma had known about their abandonment plan and had been instructed to keep it secret from me was somehow more painful than the abandonment itself. It meant that our final conversation, our last hug, our expressions of love had all been performed under false pretenses. She'd been lying to me even as she told me she loved me. "Emma, I need you to understand something very important. When people love you, they don't abandon you without explanation. They don't lie to you to make their own lives easier. They don't leave you stranded and confused because it's more convenient than having difficult conversations. I know that now. I knew it then too, but I was scared to stand up to Mom and Dad. I understand that it's hard to challenge your parents, but you're old enough to know right from wrong, and you chose wrong. The fact that your parents instructed you to lie doesn't excuse your decision to follow those instructions. I'm sorry, Grandma. I'm really, really sorry. Her apology seemed genuine, filled with the kind of remorse that suggested real understanding rather than calculated regret. But apologies couldn't undo the betrayal or restore the trust that had been broken. Emma, I appreciate your apology, but I need you to understand that sorry isn't enough to fix what happened. You participated in something cruel and deliberate, and there are consequences for that choice. Does that mean you'll never forgive me? It means that forgiveness has to be earned through changed behavior, not just requested through apologies. If you want a relationship with me going forward, it will be based on honesty and respect, not on what you think you might inherit someday. Emma nodded, tears streaming down her face. I understand, and I want you to know that I think what you're doing with the foundation is amazing. Maybe I could volunteer there sometime, when I'm older, help people like you're helping them? Her offer surprised me with its apparent sincerity. Perhaps there was hope for Emma after all. Perhaps her participation in the abandonment had been more about weakness than malice. But trust would have to be rebuilt slowly, through consistent actions rather than promising words. We'll see, Emma. Actions matter more than words, and it will take time to see what kind of person you choose to become. After she left, I felt emotionally drained, but also oddly hopeful. Emma's visit had been painful, but also necessary, forcing both of us to confront the reality of what had happened and what it would take to move forward. Unlike her parents, who remained focused on financial consequences rather than emotional repair, Emma seemed capable of genuine reflection and growth. The holidays passed quietly that year. No family gatherings, no elaborate celebrations, no pretense of relationships that had been irreparably damaged. Instead, I spent Christmas Day volunteering at a local senior center, serving meals to elderly people who had nowhere else to go. Many of them had their own stories of family abandonment, their own experiences of discovering that blood relationships didn't guarantee love or loyalty. But the day was filled with warmth and connection nonetheless. These elderly strangers shared stories, offered kindness to each other, created temporary community from shared circumstances. They reminded me that family could be chosen as well as inherited, that love could be found in unexpected places, that dignity didn't depend on other people's recognition or approval. As the new year began, the Foundation's work expanded beyond emergency assistance to include advocacy programs, educational initiatives, and community outreach efforts. We partnered with legal aid organizations to help elderly people protect themselves from financial abuse. We collaborated with healthcare providers to ensure that elderly patients received respectful treatment regardless of their family situations. We worked with social service agencies to identify and support elderly people who were being neglected or abandoned. Each program represented a different aspect of the dignity and respect that elderly people deserved but often didn't receive. Together, they created a comprehensive support system for people who'd been discarded by the families and communities that should have valued them. The Foundation's success attracted national attention, leading to speaking engagements, media, interviews, and consultation requests from other philanthropists interested in similar work. I found myself becoming an accidental advocate for elderly rights, using my story to illustrate broader patterns of ageism and family dysfunction that affected millions of people. But the most satisfying aspect of the Foundation's work remained the individual stories, the Frank Delacroix and Dorothy Chen's, whose lives were tangibly improved by targeted assistance and compassionate support. Each successful intervention reminded me that my family's betrayal, painful as it had been, had led to something meaningful and lasting. By the Foundation's first anniversary, we'd distributed more than $12 million in grants and emergency assistance, helped hundreds of elderly people navigate family crises and housing emergencies, and raised public awareness about the challenges facing abandoned elderly Americans. The organization I'd created in response to my own abandonment had become a beacon of hope for people facing similar situations. My family never stopped trying to reconcile, but their efforts remained focused on financial considerations rather than emotional repair. David continued leaving voicemails that alternated between apology and accusation. Sarah sent periodic text messages suggesting that I was being manipulated by advisors who didn't have my best interests at heart. Even Emma reached out occasionally, though her communications seemed more genuine than her parents'. But I'd moved beyond their capacity to hurt me. The Foundation had given me purpose and community, connections based on shared values rather than blood relations. The elderly people I worked with, the board members I collaborated with, the volunteers who supported our mission. They'd become my chosen family, people who valued me for who I was rather than what I might leave them. My 80th birthday had marked the end of one chapter of my life and the beginning of another. The family I'd lost through their betrayal had been replaced by a community I'd gained through their abandonment. The money they'd hoped to inherit had been transformed into a legacy that would outlast all of us, helping people they'd never meet in ways they'd never understand. Sometimes the most painful experiences in life become the most transformative ones. My family's cruelty had taught me the difference between conditional and unconditional love, between genuine relationships and convenient obligations. Their abandonment had freed me to create something meaningful with the resources I'd accumulated over a lifetime of careful stewardship. I was 81 years old now, and I'd never been happier or more purposeful. The silence from Disney World had been broken not by apologies or explanations, but by the sound of lives being rebuilt, dignity being restored, and hope being renewed. It was the best possible response to betrayal, not revenge, but redemption. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.